It's happened. The change you were all calling for. The FIA have stepped in to stop the porpoising. It is what Mercedes were asking for, but is this the change they were expecting? The drivers will now be protected, but some teams are going to have to make changes to do so. This is the biggest story of the year so far and could shake up everything on the grid. You don't want to miss this. We'll get on to why Mercedes have managed to completely screw themselves over, don't worry. But first, let's check out why the FIA have stepped in and what they've done. After round 8 of the 2022 season in Azerbaijan, it was clear that porpoising had gotten out of control. The bumpy surface of the street circuit, coupled with one of the highest speed straights on the calendar, meant that the cars were bouncing more than we've seen all year. It was a horrible combination of porpoising and bottoming out that created a serious safety problem. Lewis Hamilton almost lost control of his Mercedes multiple times at over 300 km an hour. He lost the feeling in his bottom and lower back late in the race, and every driver interview after the race highlighted that it was completely unsustainable. Luckily for the drivers, the FIA has taken quick and decisive action to protect their safety for this season. Let's start off by looking at what the FIA has to say, and then we'll examine what this means for the teams and drivers and how it might change the pecking order for the rest of the season. Bit of a spoiler for you, Toto Wolff is going to regret being the one calling for regulation changes. The FIA statement reads as follows. A technical directive has been issued to give guidance to the teams about the measures the FIA intends to tackle the problem. These include 1. Closer scrutiny of the planks and skids, both in terms of their design and the observed wear. 2. The definition of a metric based on the car's vertical acceleration that will give a quantitative limit for acceptable level of vertical oscillations. The exact mathematical formula for this metric is still being analysed by the FIA, and the Formula 1 teams have been invited to contribute to this process. The planks and skids the statement refers to are parts of the underfloor that stick out the furthest, meaning they are the parts that hit the floor. Part 2 will make use of the accelerometers that are already installed in all F1 cars as well as in the drivers' helmets. This means that the FIA has data on vertical acceleration. Using this vertical acceleration data, they can measure how much an F1 car is bouncing. Like the statement says, what the acceptable limit of bouncing is will have to be decided, but we will show you some of the data later in the video to see who the worst offenders are. The statement continues, in addition to these short-term measures, the FIA will convene a technical meeting with the teams in order to define measures that will reduce the propensity of cars to exhibit such phenomena in the medium term. The FIA has decided to intervene following consultation with its doctors in the interests of safety of the drivers. In a sport where the competitors are routinely driving at speeds in excess of 300 km an hour, it is considered that all of a driver's concentration needs to be focused on that task, and that excessive fatigue or pain experienced by a driver could have significant consequences should it result in a loss of concentration. In addition, the FIA has concerns in relation to the immediate physical impact on the health of the drivers, a number of whom have reported back pain following recent events. This statement is the perfect response from the FIA and is what we, and so many of you in our comment sections, have been calling for. There are teams on the grid that have already solved the bouncing problems or have taken steps to minimize it for driver safety. Lando Norris said after Baku that his car has very little bouncing because McLaren have raised their car's ride height to avoid it. The decision by the FIA to not change the regulations, but instead impose new rules that force the teams to reduce their own porpoising, means that teams like McLaren who've taken steps to protect their drivers' safety won't be punished. But those who have chosen not to protect their drivers will be. Before we talk about how Mercedes have really shot themselves in the foot, let's have a look at how this technical directive will be implemented. It's understood that the FIA will look at the level of bouncing in FP1 and FP2 on Friday of the race weekend. Teams will also have that data and will have to get their bouncing to below a certain level for FP3. If the team can't prove they fixed the problem for FP3, they'll be forced to raise their ride height by a minimum of 10mm. If that still doesn't solve the problem, they'll be disqualified from the race. This won't be coming into effect this weekend though. What will happen is that the FIA will observe what is going on, gather data, and see what the exact numerical details of the technical directive need to be. So while the teams might not have to make changes for Montreal, they will likely have to make changes for Silverstone, the next stop on the calendar. There are signs from the team setups that some teams are preparing for changes. Albert Fabrega tweeted showing that the Mercedes rear wing has changed significantly for the Montreal Grand Prix. It looks to be a much lower downforce wing, due to the reduced surface area, which should mean less bouncing for the team. There is no way Mercedes could have their car bouncing as much as it was in Baku. The negative PR and media backlash would be monstrous. Changes are going to have to be made by many teams on the grid. But who is going to make the biggest changes, and what is it going to do to the Formula 1 Championship this year? Well, as the rules won't come in until we leave the street circuits and head back to the proper racing tracks, let's have a look at those who are bouncing the most in Spain, the last actual racetrack the championship visited. You can see from this graph that the Alpine, Haas and Ferrari were bouncing the most. Will these levels of vertical G-force be below what the FIA deems acceptable? We don't know, but expect these teams to have to make the biggest changes if they are. Honestly, for Ferrari and Haas, having to reduce their bouncing might not be a bad thing. The Ferrari engine has been incredibly temperamental this season and hasn't been helped by the porpoising. Having to reduce the bouncing might reduce their performance, but they might finish more races as well. For Alpine, if they aren't able to maintain their performance with the changes they make, their fight with McLaren for best of the rest might come to an end. The big one that everyone will want to know about though is Mercedes. They've been the ones shouting loudest for changes to the rules, and in Baku it was obviously their drivers who were suffering the most. The team is going to be under more scrutiny than ever before in Canada thanks to their media statements, and that might be a problem. Mercedes need to lower their ride height as far as possible to make the most of their car concept this year. Toto Wolff has been harping on about their car being the fastest on the grid once they can get it low enough all season. Unfortunately, they're going to have to raise their car for the race in Montreal and potentially for the future as well, and that's going to hurt them more than others on the grid. Their no-side pod concept means they rely much more on their underfloor downforce than any other team at the moment. If they aren't able to make the most of their ground effect floor, then their downforce is going to be reduced, their performance is going to be reduced, and they're going to struggle to hold on to that third fastest spot they've dominated this season. There isn't going to be much sympathy for the Mercedes team around the sport though. Toto Wolff, George Russell and Lewis Hamilton have been incredibly vocal about wanting the FIA to step in with rule changes to help the team stop the bouncing. They were hoping for something like the introduction of active suspension though, or perhaps the addition of more floor stays. Something that was a change to the car rules that allowed them a quick fix to the issue instead of engineering it out. What they have instead got is a rule that will punish them for not solving the bouncing, instead of solving the bouncing for them. Teams like Red Bull and McLaren have rightfully been very vocal about not wanting changes to the car regulations, as that would punish the teams that have solved the problem. There was never going to be a solution that all the teams were going to be happy with, but a solution that punished teams who had done a good job of designing their car and not endangering their drivers was definitely not the right one. The Mercedes team's vocal complaints and calls for change have come back to bite them in a massive way. No one quite knows how much of an effect it's going to have on them, but we guarantee it isn't going to be good for their lap time. The entire midfield, who've had to watch Mercedes dominate the sport for years, will be rubbing their hands in glee at the prospect of the silver arrows dropping down the grid even further. I don't know about you, but I can't wait to see what happens. Want to know more about what's going on in F1? Then click the video showing on your screen and I'll see you there.